Thank you ever so much for joining us for this Reputation Group panel discussion. We wanted to have a look at the changing role of internal stakeholders in relation to external reputation. We've seen the impact of COVID-19, that famous buzzword again, fundamentally changing the way we work. We're bringing in more flexible kind of lockdown maneuvers. And we're seeing that maybe the way that companies are starting or have been treating their employees during this crisis, and even more generally, is starting to have a more concrete impact on their external reputation. And this is potentially something that's here to stay. It's kind of fair to say, I think, that many companies have felt a sense of panic, which is reflective of the kind of wider country and individual trends. And there's a real uncertainty about how to proceed, how to balance the practical task of effectively staying alive with the need to be empathetic and sensitive to a topic of, caring for people's mental and physical health. There have been some fairly epic examples of some companies that could be perceived as getting it horribly wrong. The likes of Elon Musk basically telling his employees to get back to the factories because he's going to be there because, COVID's just a hoax. Even to BA taking advantage of this situation for contract negotiations to find more favourable terms with long-term staff who've obviously kind of worked their way up through the unions and had some very preferential pay terms. So today we're looking at whether the balance of power is shifting, or the importance of internal stakeholders is shifting within the reputational field. I'm joined by three fantastic panellists today who I will ask to introduce themselves and give you a little bit of their perspective on how things have changed for them during lockdown and how they see things going forward. So perhaps, Ellie, I can see you're unmuted. So if you want to kick off first and then maybe hand over to Claire and Lesley.
I just didn't want to be the person that had to be told that they were on mute, so I thought I'd get ready. Yes, my name's Ellie, Lancaster-Smith. I'm head of people at The Guardian. I look after the editorial, digital and data teams there. And like most companies right now, we are experiencing a lot of remote working. We're having to adapt, work in a very different way to how we previously did. We've kind of got a skeleton staff in the office at the moment doing most of the written editorial and production, and then all of the other teams are working from their kitchen tables. So yeah, I can certainly comment on that and tell you a bit about how we've been running things from the perspective that in the HR team at The Guardian, and yeah, I'll comment on some of the things that I've experienced personally, I'm sure, as well.
Fantastic. Claire, I think you're on mute currently.
I am, yeah. There was quite a loud helicopter flying over our apartment. So yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Claire. I lead the talent acquisition team, people services team and technology team at Finastra, which is not a household brand, so it's a 10,000 employee strong fintech company, the third largest fintech in the world. So we provide kind of mission critical software for the financial services industry. So similarly to Ellie, our world got turned upside down with COVID, and what we've seen is that it was a crisis management response at the beginning, and now what we're trying to move into is more of what have we learned, and what have we learned that we want to take forward into the future and to develop and shape our new kind of customer and employee proposition, and kind of really reinvent the way that we work and how we enable us to work more digitally, more effectively, as we kind of come through COVID. Having said that, I know it looks like there's a second peak for the rest of COVID, and then as we reboard back into the workplace.
Fantastic. And Lesley,
hi, I'm Lesley Benson, and I head up FTI Consulting's people and transformation practice. And of course, I spent most of my life with the clients in one form or the other, helping them think through workforce issues, and obviously particularly issues relating to COVID-19. But it is an interesting question in terms of how we've tackled it at FTI. I will tell you, I'm actually sitting in our office today, and I'm one of about 8 people in our London office. There are about normally about 800 people here and about 5,500 people around the world. And actually, FTI has done probably 2 or 3 things really rather well. I mean, one is that, you know, we've really changed the kind of conversation we're having with our staff. It's more frequent. It is, in a sense, democratized, and perhaps we'll talk about that a little bit later. And we're also actually taking advantage of the next few months to reshape our workspace into a more collaborative environment, on the basis that we're pretty convinced that the new normal is going to be really rather different to the one that we've come from.
Fantastic. So we're looking forward to a really interesting conversation. Just on a bit of housekeeping, we've got about half an hour for kind of interactive chat amongst ourselves, and then about 15 minutes or so for Q&A. So if you do have any queries, thoughts, or things you'd like to raise, please do put them either in the Q&A box or in the chat, and we'll work through them at the end. Perfect. So maybe, Ellie, I'm going to put you in the hot seat first. So we're talking about, you know, HR as a kind of top line best practice approach. So how do you see organisations having to change to cope with the kind of more socially distanced workforce? Has the employee-employer relationship changed at all? You're on mute.
And that is why I unmuted myself at the beginning. Yeah, I think with Zoom calls like this one and Google Hangouts and all of the other kind of suite of technology that we've got at the moment has kind of allowed us to think that we can just kind of keep calm and carry on and just conduct our jobs in the way that we always have done without really having to change anything. But in truth, this, like you said, this new socially distanced workforce has meant that HR best practice has had to change. So yeah, taking a moment outside all things COVID-19, which I know is hard for everybody at the moment, I kind of found myself looking at Forbes and had a look to see what other HR practitioners were citing as their main kind of HR agenda item for 2020 before the world suddenly changed. And interestingly, well-being was the top priority and came out as #1 for the HR agenda for this year. And so it should be. Stress levels, they also state, have risen 20% over the last 3 decades. So well-being obviously is something that we all need to look at. And when I think of well-being, the first thing that springs to mind in a well-being program for an HR person, I think, is usually flexible working. It's the first thing that people ask for. They want to get a full night's sleep and get up at 7 o'clock rather than having to get up at 5:30 a.m. and dash for the train. They want to pick up their kids from school rather than having to stress out about making train connections. And more than anything else, they want to be flexible with their hours and just manage their own time. So normally with a program, HR would spend heaps of time putting policies together, ensuring it's fit for purpose, meets best practice. And unfortunately, in these current times, we have not had any time to do any of that. So we've got a percentage of people enjoying life and in the situation that I've just detailed. But we've also got a heap of people sitting in bedsits and with 3 or 4 housemates around a kitchen table, which is less than ideal, of course. So to answer your question, Jenna, about best practice, the first part of the question, I think the most important thing in all of this is thinking about communication and this new way of remote working and making sure that our staff don't feel disconnected from the company that they work. I mean, just speaking from personal experience at The Guardian, I've spoken to people that have started post-March that have said, I live in Islington, I've walked past The Guardian heaps of times all my life, and I've started and I've not even walked through the doors. Like, they don't understand the type of company they work for, they don't know about our values, and that's something that you can really only get from working in the building. So I think in terms of HR best practice, we really need to look at how we get to that point remotely, because like Lesley said at the beginning, this is the new normal. Well, for the foreseeable future it will be. So we really need to think about concentrating on embedding cultures within organisations where people still feel connected. Now that could be doing lots of online team meetings, remote mentoring. At The Guardian, we're focusing quite heavily at the moment on remote mentoring, making sure that people still have this support network. And kind of blended L&D programs, making sure that a learning and development offering doesn't suffer just because people are at home. So ensuring that they still have access to those things. And lastly, I know I'm kind of talking to the right people here, but just communication. I mean, just going OTT on communication rather than less so, and ensuring that you keep up to date with teams, and that you're sharing and knowledge sharing, making sure that you're not detached from the people that you used to sit right behind. In terms of the employer and employee relationship, which I think was the second part of your question, it's not necessarily a change, but I think the single most important thing is trust, really. In HR, we have a term, the psychological contract, which basically is the unwritten expectations that exist between the employer and the employee. So by that, I mean things like mutual beliefs, shared common ground that give employees confidence in being considered for career development opportunities, or that's just an example, or not being left out on that, out of the loop on things when other team members are kind of being included. So I think that's really important. Trust has just got to be established, and again, I think communication is really beneficial there. So the more we keep our staff up to date on company progress and developments, the more we manage to instill trust and confidence. And I think that's the single most important, not change whilst we're working like this, but the most important thing that we instill when, like you say, dealing with a socially distanced workforce.
Understood. Claire, did you want to jump in on that? I know that you kind of talking about the early days of the lockdown and all the work that you guys had to do around that.
Yeah, so I would say that I'm very lucky to work for Finastra, because we're very customer first, but we're also health and safety first. So one of the great moments at the start of the pandemic for the organisation was when Simon, our CEO, with the support of the executive leadership team, basically said, if we keep our workforce safe and healthy, then we're going to serve our customers in a better way. We use the phrase, put your own oxygen mask on first. You're talking about BA, so we use an aeroplane analogy for that. And that's something that's really kind of been a guiding principle through the crisis management phase of the pandemic, but also as we start to look at the shift in the proposition. So if you take health and safety as a baseline, then the conundrum becomes, how do you balance business continuity with empathy and changing the way of working? So as we've started to look at our proposition, we've kind of said to the employees that there is a give and a get for the proposition. We have to hit our numbers as an organisation. We're resilient to COVID because of the nature of our business, but we're certainly not immune, and therefore we have to do some stuff that allows us to hit the numbers. We have to live our culture and our behaviours. We have to keep participating and be activists in the work that we do. But in return, what we're going to do is we're really going to help to reshape work. So not just move what you were doing into a virtual environment and create burnout and all these other types of things that people are seeing, but really look at where within the proposition we can tailor stuff so you can create your own kind of personalized life work balance. you know, can you take more vacation than you did before? Or what does remote working look like? You know, where should we encourage you to take time off? You know, take your kid to school for the first day. You know, those moments that matter, that see people through and make them and help them be more productive, because they really feel that there's a fair relationship built between the employer and the employee. So that's the kind of phase that we're in at the moment, which is looking at what do our customers need, and therefore how we need to reshape the future of work. So we take care of our numbers and our business, but we're also taking care of our employees' well-being and safety and health as well.
Fantastic. I mean, Lesley, as a transformation expert, you must have really kind of seen this transition period as kind of a seismic shift in terms of, have you ever seen anything quite so dramatic in the past, or is COVID really kind of breaking new ground in terms of the speed and drama of the change that's required?
I mean, I do think this is completely unprecedented. I mean, for those people that have lived through wartime scenarios, of course, there's perhaps more drama related to that. But I think this has been more seismic, to use your word, than anything before. And I think the seismic shift, you know, is to a large extent connected to a reality that I think that both Ellie and Claire made reference to, and that is that essentially, you know, in this new hybrid working environment that we have gone into, we are moving away from cultures that are more command and control based to cultures that are more self-directed. And in doing that, you know, it's, you know, and thinking about then the link to reputation, which you were referencing earlier, you know, we've got to really think very carefully about what organizations need to do differently to create an employee value proposition that is linked to an employer brand that employers can really stand behind. And I think, you know, in our experience of this so far, the starting point is always, in a sense, to ensure that you have a leadership that is inclusive, that to use that both words that Ellie and Claire referenced in terms of empathy, and to ensure that leaders are able to lean into their teams in a way that is really very different. And perhaps we can sort of build on that a little further down the line.
Interesting. And from a kind of perspective, you know, that sometimes can be a difficult shift from a real kind of traditional command and control type of structure. I'd be interested in understanding from all of you, from your different perspectives, I mean, what kind of skills, you know, we talk about the soft skills and the need for that kind of upskilling and in a normal leadership progression anyway. What kind of new skills or new training do you think is needed, if any, or is it just a case of maybe accelerating what would already be in that pipeline?
Well, if I answer that question first, then I would say, you know, Ellie was making reference to learning and development. It's kind of ironic in a way, and I'm sure everybody on this Zoom call is experiencing this, is that never has there been a time for more learning, and never has been a time when, in some ways, you know, traditional or conventional ways of learning have been more disrupted. But I do think, in my experience of working with clients over the last few weeks and months, that actually both the content of learning and how things are done needs to change along with the delivery method. Let me give an example. I mean, you know, one of the things that we're seeing across the board, and I bet there are loads of people on the call that would appreciate this, is that if you look at organizations with young, new employees, graduate intakes, people at the start of their careers, how people got apprenticed, so to speak, at this, 6 months ago, 12 months ago, is very different to how they're being apprenticed now. How do leaders, how do managers, supervisors, team leaders, team players actually coach and enable people to work effectively? So the whole concept, the whole skill set around coaching, giving and receiving feedback, allowing people to do show and tell in different kinds of ways and build their skills, needs to be changed and upgraded. And you know, I think it's incumbent on HR professionals, but also leaders and others in organizations to think differently about the frequency of interactions, how they coach, how they ultimately teach people to do things, and particularly where you know, the water cooler moment is not going to be available in the same way, is not relying on serendipitous kind of interactions, but rather, in a sense, being clear about when you're going to be talking to people to ensure that people are learning consistently through, you know, all of their working experience at work.
Claire, since you moved from that crisis response kind of initial phase onto this longer term planning phase, has that been an element that's maybe come through in your planning as well, thinking about how you support your leadership team?
Yeah, absolutely. So we were on a journey to, we call it inverting the triangle already. So if I look back a couple of years ago, we were in a command and control environment, and we were already, as I say, kind of turning the leadership pyramid on its head, and creating a more servant leadership mentality. And we're almost in the end stage of that by creating our kind of 1,300 line managers, formalizing their role and really understanding how they can help us drive the new kind of culture and ways of working. And you know, so much so that you know, within our business plan and project plan for the business case, sorry, for the whole transition, we very much called out the need to invest in leadership training, so frontline manager training, because if you're, you know, it comes back to this trust piece. If you've been in a top-down organization, there's a lack of trust across the whole pyramid, the whole kind of leadership pyramid. And if you're trying to instill trust in the organization, you have to have a line manager group that can really have the maturity to trust their employees, to manage their own time, to create what a great work-life balance looks like for them, whilst keeping an eye on productivity and things like that. So yeah, hugely important, inverting the triangle and really focusing on those 1,300 line managers that we have that lead the whole organization, and giving them the tools they need to be successful and the mind shift they need to be successful.
Interesting. And Ellie, just to kind of give your perspective on this in terms of the training and upskilling that you think is now needed.
Well, I completely agree with what's been said, but and considering now we are all kind of working in this remote way, really great people management. I can't remember if it was Claire or Lesley said that. I think it was Claire that said leadership training kind of takes precedence over line management training. Now it's more important and it's more difficult than it's ever been, and any HR professional will tell you that attrition data shows us that people don't leave jobs, they leave managers. And working in this really socially distanced way, the way that we manage needs to adapt accordingly. So for upskilling, for me, management training and leadership training is obviously important, but it's a new type of management training which focuses on getting the best out of teams that are having to work in silos, or not even silos, but just individually and completely alone, rather than in this group environment. I think management and leadership training in the past has really focused on insights, Myers-Briggs, and working together and working in a team environment. And of course, that's kind of gone out the window because we're all sitting around our kitchen tables by ourselves. And so although technology's come on leaps and bounds, creative brainstorms are still really hard. So those in creative roles will be finding that difficult. So upskilling in areas like that, I think, need to be a key focus and something that we need to really concentrate on for the new normal.
Do you think that the actual nature of what good leadership is now fundamentally changing to kind of respond to this? You know, if we're talking about upskilling, is there actually the kind of the course material and the expertise available for us to actually give people these skills?
I would say right now, yes, but limited. But I think it's improving. I mean, and it's going to have to. We're all, sessions like this is, I suppose, would be a form of leadership style, and we wouldn't have had this. I bet this session wouldn't have run quite in this way. Correct me if I'm wrong. It may not have run in this way 3 or 4 months ago, but now we've kind of just all adapted to doing so, and I think leadership is having to follow the same path. So yeah, leaders are getting used to having to run meetings online, and trainers are getting used to having to run leadership sessions online. So yeah, I think we will adapt. It may not be quite as nice and quite it's always nice to go on a training program and mix with your colleagues and learn about kind of working styles and all that kind of thing, but yeah, I think we just need to adapt and do the same kind of thing, but mirroring the situation that we now live in.
Fantastic, thank you. Claire, it's a couple of words that you've all used throughout this, kind of trust, fairness, the need to live the values of the organisation. I mean, obviously COVID and lockdown isn't the only significant event that's happened in the world these past 6 months. So, you know, and they've also had fairly significant impacts on external reputation, thinking specifically about the Black Lives Matter movement, and how that's really shone a light on some key work issues like institutional racism, the lack of diversity, and it's maybe proven how COVID-19 has disproportionately affected BAME groups. How does a company like yours ensure that you're really proactively responding not only to the challenges of a global pandemic and a health crisis, but the cultural changes that are happening and that are also impacting your internal stakeholders and the external reputation that is generated as a result? So I, you know, I'm a big believer of don't let a crisis go without leveraging it for positive effect as well. So it's accelerated, COVID's accelerated the future of work. I would say the BLM movement's accelerated the work that organisations do around their purpose. So you know, again, Finastra's been on their journey around purpose for quite a while, and we have three pillars: financial inclusion, social innovation, and our environment mission. And we've done some fantastic things like educate 5,000 people in rural India on financial literacy, and teach 9,000 children how to code in underprivileged areas and things like that. So I mean, we've been on the journey. I think this massively accelerated it. And if I take the BLM movement in particular, firstly, we're drinking our own champagne. So, you know, I look after talent acquisition, and therefore one of my key KPIs is Glassdoor. And that's because people are very honest on Glassdoor. It's an interesting metric for investors, for basically for all stakeholders in your organization. And therefore, if you're going out with your purpose statements and doing all these fantastic things, but you're not doing the same internally, then you really do risk your employees feeling that there's an incongruence in the way that you're managing your external reputation and your internal authentic employee value proposition, bringing that to life. So we've got a very, very active ERG. You know, we're looking at the employee life cycle and how we can bring more diversity into the organisation and accelerate diversity within the organisation that sometimes hasn't been pulled through in some of the processes that the organisations run. And then it's very hard to get this data, as I'm sure everyone that works in a global organisation knows. So we're also doing a Count Me In campaign. So we feel like we're really kind of living it within the organisation, really understanding our baseline and how we can improve on that. And then from an external perspective, America brought in what they called the CARES Act, which provided paycheck protection for a whole load of people. So it's like a $2 billion economic relief mechanism. And Finastra got a product to market incredibly quickly within a matter of days that enabled small businesses to act to receive this PPP payment. And as a result, we've reinvested about $2 million back into Feeding America.
And as you said in your kind of question, these things sadly disproportionately impact minority groups, and therefore, I think we're disproportionately helping minority groups through some of the things that we're doing to help the financial services industry become a bit more inclusive.
Fantastic. We've actually had a question that I'd like to bring in at this stage because I think it's really relevant. So Kevin Ruck asked, he wonders if organisations value internal communication as a specialist function more now. And you would think that with the growing importance of internal stakeholders, that would kind of come as a given, but we all know that that's not always the case. I mean, as the HR team or as the kind of external consultant who's advising a business on transforming its internal structure, where does internal comms come into your way of working, your plans and your dealings? Maybe Lesley, you can pick this one up first.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think internal communications, in a sense, sets the ecosystem through which organizations communicate messages about where they're going and how they're going to do that in an effective kind of way. And I think that one of the challenges that we've seen with COVID as people have moved into hybrid or home working environments is that how and what people want to hear has changed, and therefore the community of people inside organizations that are determining what kind of dialogue needs to happen and how messages are transmitted and received needs to shift as well. And I think that, in this environment, going back to some of the original points that were made at the beginning of the organization, at the beginning of this conversation, the internal comms environment, which in a sense should be a partnership between leadership, between business leaders, between HR and between communications, should set the environment in which that trust is communicated effectively, that sense of hope in terms of where the future is going needs to be put into place, that the organization is seen and is behaving compassionately in the way in which it is behaving, and that it creates a sense of stability for people during times of change. And I guess Ellie and Claire themselves also, if they looked at what is happening in their organizations and they looked at how comms laddered up to those points, would be able to identify where perhaps the organization needs to place more or less emphasis. I do think, linked to this is in internal comms within that infrastructure is also a need to ensure that communications, particularly in this kind of environment, is not just top down, but also bottom up, in the sense that it provides an opportunity for people really to express what they're thinking and feeling, and to ensure then that there is a mechanism within that individuals and people generally are seen to be responsive to those needs that are being articulated by people all over the organization.
Claire or Ellie, did you have anything to add?
Do you want to go, Ellie?
Sorry,
no,
I'll make you fight.
No, go for it.
I was just going to emphasize the point that for me, it's, the framework of how you communicate internally and externally has to be congruent. So yeah. So if you're saying stuff externally about the culture that you're developing and things like that, you have to be dropping the proof points internally to make that authentic and to build your brand advocacy within your own organization, not just externally, to just develop that authenticity. That was the only thing I was going to add.
Perfect.
But I do think just one additional point perhaps is Claire made reference to Glassdoor, right? I'm sure, if in 6 months' time you looked at your own Glassdoor results and how people were evaluating the organization, you can almost immediately see the kind of questions that people would be asking, and therefore what organizations need to be doing. So, the question would be, was my manager responsive to me? So from an internal comms point of view, to what extent are we helping managers or leaders to actually engage with people effectively? Did the organization help me to organize my work effectively? The value proposition changed around flexible working? Did we communicate and engage with people on how to do that? And I think this sense of, if we're going to, our reputation as an organization should be representative of actually the extent to which we're actually demonstrating real efforts to support our staff and our vulnerable employees through this. So internal comms needs to follow that requirement.
Wonderful. Thanks for the question, Kevin. I'd like to open up the floor to any other questions. So if you have any thoughts or queries based on what we've been chatting about so far, please do put them in either the chat box or the Q&A box. You should find them at the bottom of the Zoom window. In the meantime, while we're waiting for any last questions to come through, I guess I'm just interested in, I think we kind of all agree that there is a shift and there is, a growing importance of the internal stakeholders for external reputation. Do we think it's a permanent development? Is it something that could potentially be reversed? We can have very short memories as human beings when we get through these kind of crises. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think there's no turning back and this is going to be kind of onwards and upwards, or is there going to be the elastic band effect where people kind of naturally snap back once we're all back to piling onto the tube and packing into the office? Ellie, let me throw that at you first.
My best mystic Meg. I don't think it'll go back to the way it was. I don't see how it can really. Who knows when there'll be a vaccine, and all the time there isn't, then we're going to have a large proportion of people that don't feel safe going back to how it was. And I know that you've spoken before about how we deal with that situation and getting people back to work. But I don't think it can go back to how it was, but I think we have proved that we can work in this way. And so I think, like Lesley said, there could be some form of hybrid. There already is. I mean, a lot of companies are kind of operating with skeleton staff in offices, and then a lot of others remotely. And I think for a lot of the kind of more traditional companies, I'm talking the opposite of the Googles and Facebooks and Netflix that have been offering flexibility as a benefit and a retention tool for so long. For the more traditional companies that thought that flexible working could never happen, we've proved as a global workforce that it can. So to answer the question in this roundabout way, I think we'll see some form of a mix. I don't think it'll go back to how it was, commuting and doing the 9 to 5:30, or no, much longer than that if you're in our kind of industries. Let's be honest. But I think we'll kind of come up with a hybrid.
Fantastic. Claire, did you have any thoughts to add to that?
No, I think we'll end up. I agree. I think we'll end up with a hybrid. I think we're, as an organisation, we're in that space. So flexibility, but then also respect the fact that that we want to create a kind of beehive effect when people are in the office, where it's about collaborating to innovate, not sitting in rows of desks and working. So we're reconfiguring to get Lesley and his organisation to really make that collaboration space where people want to come in to do certain things, but don't feel like they have to, when they want to get their head down and do some work, then feel free to go and do that from home and things like that. So I believe we'll end up in a hybrid model too.
Fantastic. And Lesley, final thoughts from you?
I would say, I think it's inevitable there's going to be a hybrid kind of environment, exactly as Ellie and Claire were describing. But I would challenge everybody to think just perhaps one step ahead, is that, rather than, in a sense, thinking that you can arrive at some kind of new operating model and working environment by default, what would happen if you said, well, why don't we see what we can do by design? In Finastra, for example, where Claire works, there's a fantastic working group inside that with the organization that is thinking actively about what the future workplace should be. And to the extent that as an employer, you can get ahead of that curve, you can still be flexible and you can still be agile in where you're taking your thinking. So you're in a position to both sort of reshape what your employer brand looks like, and in a sense say, we're developing the workplace of the future. It won't be as extreme as it is currently. We know that human beings are social beings, and particularly for younger people at the start of their careers who need the workplace as a social environment in a very different way to perhaps people, you know, in the latter stages of their careers. Finding that balance and creating a future workspace is an entirely doable thing, but it takes a bit of design.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Any other questions? Haven't seen anything come through. So in that case, I think we can wrap up. If anybody has any individual questions for the panelists, I think if you contact Kiri or myself, then we'll be happy to put them to them as a follow-up and come back to you individually. I think from my perspective, listening to you all speak today, it's been incredibly interesting. I think with the way that external reputation is evolving, it's almost the building blocks of that reputation, and the relative weights that each of them have is shifting kind of as we evolve in the workforce, and ultimately there will be different levels of importance and kind of more default settings for trust, you know, whereas before with flexible working, it was one of the key things that managers said, we can't do flexible working because we need to be able to see exactly what our team is doing, you know, by standing and staring over their shoulders. That's been taken off the table completely. So I think the way that we build trust and build culture and create that external perception and reputation at the end of the day is what people say about you behind your back. So, you know, the way that people are dealing with their employees is going to be absolutely fundamental to that. I'd like to thank all of the panelists who've joined us today for this. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I think we can wrap it up there. Thank you so much.